Alright everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Spicer from Credit Cop Studios, and welcome back to the beginner scripting series of 2023. And in today's lesson, we're going to be going over variables and properties on Roblox Studio. So let's get right into it. Alright, so last lesson, we learned about printing. So, for this lesson, we're going to start off with learning about variables. So, you can go to your script and then open it up. I don't remember if I mentioned this before in the last episode, but I'll say it again just in case. Is if you closed out of your script like this and you didn't know how to get back into it, you just double click this script icon right here, the paper. You double click that and you should be taken back to this. And I already wrote something for a test earlier, so I'm just going to delete that. And now we are going to go over variables first. So what a variable is here. I'll have to write it to show you. So let's say this test equals game.workspace dot part 1. Alright, so this is a variable. So I'm gonna go over what this means right now. So earlier today I inserted a part into Roblox. It's up here, and actually I didn't do this today, I did this yesterday because I tried filming this video before and it didn't go so well. I forgot to do a bunch of stuff, so I have to re-record it, so that's why some stuff is already here. But if you don't know how to add in a part in Roblox Studio, up here you'll see part. You want to press that, and then a part should come in here. And if you want to rename it, you can right click this, then you can click rename, and then you can type whatever you want. I'm just going to delete that. You can delete stuff by pressing backspace. So now I'm going back to the script to show you what this means. So game.workspace.part1, that is what we're going to be looking at first. Game. Okay, so what does game mean? Well, game is obviously referring to the game, but what it more specifically, it's referring to over here on the Explore tab, all these services. All these services are part of the game. So whenever we say game to the script, we're telling the script that we want to access one of these services. So once we do that, we say .workspace, which that means we're telling the script we want to access the game, and then we want to access the workspace. And then we do .part1, so then we're telling the script that we want to access part 1. So that's basically how you access stuff through a script. So if you wanted to, get this part 1 right here, you would have to write game.workspace.part1. And you might be asking that why can't we just write maybe like part 1 if we wanted to use part 1? And that is because when you're scripting, you need to be really specific. So you can't just say part 1 and then tell the script what you want to do with part 1, because it doesn't know where part 1 is. So you have to define where part 1 is before you actually are able to do stuff with it. So that's what game.workspace means. We're just telling the script that we want to access the game, and then the workspace, and then part 1. These dots in the middle, you have to put those there. You can't access it with spaces like this. That's not gonna work. If you were to get rid of the dots, that's not gonna work. You can't say game workspace part 1. You just have to have the dots here, else it won't work. So just make sure you add the dots when you're trying to access something. So hopefully that part makes sense. We'll touch on that a little more in a minute. Anyways, let's go back over here to test and equal. So basically we're telling the script test is equal to game.workspace.part1. That is what we're telling the script, and that is what a variable is. So test, we're telling the script that test, whenever we say test in the script, it is the same value, or it's equal to game.workspace.part1, or if we simplified that, that would be just part 1. So we're basically just telling the script test is equal to part 1. So that means whenever we say test in our script, it will know that we are talking about part 1, because we define that this is equal to this. So an example of that is now when properties come in. So now we're going to talk about properties. So now if you don't know what properties are, if I come over here to this part and I select this, you'll see under here properties. If you don't have that, come over to the view tab on the top and then over here press properties, but it should be there by default. And then you want to press properties, and when you press it, you will see a list of properties, different things you can do to change the part. Like you have brick color, you can change the brick color through this color palette. And then you have color, is like a more precise way of changing colors. And then you have reflectance and transparency, can collide, and anchor. Those are like the main things you would be using, properties you will be using. And you would also be using materials, so you have different materials you can change it to. So those are like the main properties you will be using when you're scripting or just building stuff in general. So I'm going to tell you how to like change them through a script now. So we're going to use a variable for this. I'm going to explain to you now what variables can be useful for through the use of learning what properties are. Hopefully that makes sense. So before I actually do talk more about variables, let's just talk about properties real quick. So I'm just going to write game.workspace.part1 right here. You can double click that if you wanted to. And then dot brick color equals brick color dot new. Then in parentheses, in a string, we'll write really red. So, what this line of code means is, we already touched on what game.workspace.part1 means, or you can change part1 to whatever name your part is in your workspace. You don't have to call it part1, you can call it whatever you want, it doesn't really matter, but just make sure to change the name to whatever part or whatever you named your part or object, or else the script won't know what you're talking about. So we wrote game.workspace.part1, so we're telling the script we want to access part1 in the workspace. And also, I forgot to mention, if you don't want to write game here, you can just write workspace like this, but you have to make sure you don't capitalize workspace. You can write that as well, but if you write game.workspace, you need to make sure this is capitalized. So I'm just going to keep it like this for now. So you can also, like I said, you can write workspace.part1 if you wanted to, but usually I like to write game.workspace. I don't know why, I just like to do that. But let's keep going. So now we say .brick color after part1. So that means we already accessed the part1 by going to workspace and then to part1, and now we want to go into the properties and then go to the property brick color. So we're telling the script that we want to change or do something with the brick color. So now what equals brick color.new and then really red, it's basically like a variable kind of, but it's not a variable. It's kind of works like a variable, I guess. I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly, but basically we're saying that this property right here, brick color, that game workspace, that part1, that brick color, so brick color, we're saying brick color is the same value, or you can say equals brick color.new, and then in the string we put really red. So we're basically saying that this property is equal to really red. So that's what we're saying. You have to write brick color.new, and then in parentheses in a string you would have to write really red. You can't just say really red, because as you can see right now it thinks that it's like a variable or something, or just thinks it's just a line of code and doesn't know what it's supposed to mean. It says incomplete statement, so that's not going to work. So you have to write brick color.new, and then in a string in parentheses you can write whatever color you want, but it has to be part of this color wheel right here. If you don't know what a color's name is, you can just hover over one of these colors and it will tell you the name. Right there it says really red, so that's what I'm changing it to, really red, in the script. So when I write that in, it should work. So now if I run the game, you should see that this part will change its color to really red, just like that. Then when I stop the game, it should go back to gray, medium stone gray, which is the default color. And the reason it only works through when you run the game or play the game is because scripts only work when you run or play the game. So whenever you are just in studio and you're not running the game or anything, it won't work. Scripts only run whenever you're like testing or running the game. So now we're going to talk about variables, how variables can be used for this. So first of all, we know how to change one property of a part. You can change brick color. So now up here, you remember we wrote test is equal to game.workspace.part1. So test is equal to part1. So that means every time we write test in our script exactly like this script will know that we're talking about part1. So we can get rid of workspace.part1 here. Oops. Like this. We delete that. And then we can just write test. Let me get rid of it. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. You write test.brickcolor equals brickcolor.new. That will do the same thing. So you don't have to write game.workspace.part1, you don't have to write, you don't have to do this. I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. You don't have to write this because the script already knows that we're talking about game.workspace.part1 because we define all of that and we're putting it inside this variable. So think of variables as, I'm just going to delete that part. Think of variables as like a holder, like a placeholder, like a storage container for whatever you're trying to put in there. So think of test as a storage container for part1, game.workspace.part1. So this is what we want to put in the storage container, and this is the storage container. So every time we say test, it knows that we're talking about whatever we put in the storage container, which is this. Alright? So, now what the use of variables are, is if you have maybe something like really long, like let's just say, I'm just going to rename my part to, I'm going to rename it to something really long like this. It's just really random bunch of words. So if you had a part name like really long or something, it doesn't have to be a part, it can be anything. You had a really long name of something and you want to shorten it. Maybe I'll get rid of this and I'll say part. I'm going to get rid of that now because we're not talking about that anymore. So now we're saying part here. Part is equal to game.workspace.part1. Now we have to get rid of part1 because there is no more part1 or nothing named part1 in the workspace anymore. So I'm just going to write this and there we go. Whenever I write something, it gives me suggestions to autofill what I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to say this. So this is the name of my part and it's just a bunch of random stuff. It looks really weird. But now, the script knows whenever we say part, we're talking about this, which is the name of our part. So we can write part, oops, not mean to do that, part dot brick color, and then equals brick color dot new, really red. So, let's run the game. And it should do the exact same thing. So those are what variables are used for. They're basically storage containers for whatever value you put into it, or whatever you put into it. So whatever you put into it is the same value or is equal to whatever the name of your variable is. So we'll touch on this more in future episodes. You'll understand why this is so useful and why we would need to use variables. But this is what a variable is. So before we end off the video, let's go over a few more properties that you can change. Because if I go here to the properties, we learned how to change the brick color, but there are some more properties that we need to touch on because you can't all change it the same way. So you can't just go like game.workspace dot whatever I name my part dot. Then maybe you wanted to change the transparency. You can't just say transparency is equal to transparency dot new and then write the number of your transparency. That won't work. You can't do it like that. each property has a different way of changing it. Some have the same kind of way, but transparency is another property, which is this one. And as you can see here, it's not a color like this, it's a number like this. So anything in between 0 to 1 is transparency. So that means we'd have to do this. So what this does is we're saying we're wanting to access this part name. Hold on, let me just change the part's name right here, just to part 1 again, so I don't have to write this all the time anymore. Part 1. There you go. Now they're saying we're telling the script that we want to access part 1, and then the property transparency, you want to set that transparency to 1. So we're just saying the transparency property is equal, or it has the same value as 1, which means the value 1 would be this 1. And what 1 does is, if you come over here, this part is transparent, but it's still there. So if I change it, anything in the middle, you would kind of be able to see through it. And if I change it back to 0, it will be completely solid and you can see through it. So whenever we run this, it should make the part transparent, but it's still there. So that's what transparency does. You can change it through a script like this. This is how you would write transparency. And if you wanted to change another property, like anchored is another useful property. Anchored is equal to true. Okay, so this uses a Boolean value next. So far, let me just actually copy this real quick so I can rewrite what I just wrote before. This time I'm going to write transparency again is equal to 1, and then this time we're going to write brick color dot new, and then let's do really red again. So we went over these two right here, these two properties, and how to change them through a script. So this property is changed by an int value, which is a number, and then this one is changed by a string value, which is a string of text. And then this one, which is we haven't learned yet, is changed by a Boolean value, which is a true or false statement. So this means we're saying we want to access the part 1, then the property anchored. The property anchored would be this one down here, anchored. Right now it's set to true, that means it is anchored. And if you don't know what anchored is, if I was to unanchor this, you can do it by clicking this up here, or pressing anchored here in the properties. So if I was to run the game and the part wasn't anchored, it would do this. Oops, what happened? Hold on, wait, what did I do? Oh wait, it's because I put in the script. Let me set this back to false. Okay, so if it was set to false, if anchored was not on, the part would fall, and it would bounce, and now it's down here. So another example of that would be, if I was to play here, if I was to spawn into my game, right here, you would see that when I come down here to the part, I'm able to move it. Well, I can't really move it because I'm too big to move it, but if the part was a little bit bigger, I would be able to move it, like around, by just running into it. So that's what anchor does. If you were to anchor it, it will keep it in one position, so when you run the game, gravity doesn't make it fall, it stays in one position. So changing anchored through a script will be either true or false. If we say true, that means anchored will be set to true. That means it will be anchored, but if we change it to false, whenever we run the game, anchored will be set to false, which means it won't be anchored and it will just fall, or it will not be anchored in one position when you join in the game. So that's what anchored is, and we'll just use one more property today. If you want, you can look up more properties in another video, but for the sake of this video, we're not going to be learning every single property because there's a lot of properties. We're just touching over like some of the basic ones. But if you want to look up more, you can do that as well. Or we might touch on this some more properties later in the series. So for today, we're just learning some basic properties. So the last one we're going to be learning is can collide property. So we're going to set this to true. And we're going to do this, false. We're going to set this to false. Now I'm going to put this down here, the part down here. And what this does is, you will see in a second, when I come in the game and I come over here, I can run through the part like this. So that means I can walk through the part, my body kind of goes through the part. But if I was to stop the game and I was to change this to true, that means whenever I load into the game, you will see that when I go over to my parts, I can touch it, and now I stand on top of it. It doesn't really look like it, because my foot is kind of still going through the part a little bit, but you can see that I am actually physically touching the part. So that's what Can Collide does. It's basically telling you if you can collide with it or not, and that property is in here. Oops. That property is in here, right here, Can Collide, true or false. And that's what this does in the script. So that's how you change it through a script. You use Boolean values. And just for reference, check marks, like being able to check or uncheck, is a Boolean value. Being able to change the number of something through here is a int value. And being able to change like the color, its name or something, or material, is usually a string value, or it is a string value. So hopefully that helps you with properties and variables, and that will be it for today's video, sorry. And if you are still confused, I tried my best to explain it to you, but you know, if you didn't understand everything, you can go watch some other people's tutorials on this same subject. If you didn't understand it, or if you did, you can make sure to subscribe and like the video for more videos like this, and episode 3 should be coming soon. And if you didn't understand this video, you can rewatch it if you want to as well, and hopefully you can understand it through that as well. And whenever I was learning scripting, I'm still learning some parts, because learning like scripting really never ends. You keep learning new stuff all the time, even if you don't know something. That's the whole process of scripting. Even if you don't know something, you can relearn it, or you can learn something new. Even if you are like a really good pro, you would still need to be able to learn through something else. You might be able to learn new things. So whenever I was learning scripting, I watched multiple people's videos to understand one subject, but that's just me. So you can do that if that is what works for you, but hopefully you learned something in this video. Hopefully you were able to understand. I tried my best, and thank you again for watching today's video. It's been Spicer, and I'm out. I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.